Hudson is our Natalie Hudson is our Chief Justice. Something that's you may find interesting is we have mandatory retirement in our state. At the age of 70, you have to step down. At that point, the governor appoints a replacement. But you have to run for re-election. We'll talk more about that in a moment. This is the current bench. We actually have three are fairly new, appointed by Governor Walz in the last year or so. That's unusual to get that much turnover, but it's just luck of the draw. People reach 70. Actually, Justice Gilday and somebody else retired early. They just chose to retire early for one reason or another. I think we can go inside the court now if you'd like. So yeah, just go in through that metal gate. You can get your name on the ballot and run against one of the incumbents. And about every 20 years or so, somebody successfully does that and unseats one of the incumbent justices. So here's a trivia question for you, for Minnesotans. Who was the last person to successfully do that? It's a household name. I know you're familiar with him. Clue number one, our first African American justice. Clue number two, and this is the closer. Go ahead. Ellen Page. I didn't even have to get to the second. Very good. Ellen Page, very interesting man. The second question, or the second clue, is he was a former football player, professional football player, Vikings and the Bears. Very interesting man. He actually studied law while he was playing professional football. Very unusual, especially back in those days, back in the 80s. He had a great career as a professional attorney downtown Minneapolis. Got the call of public service. He got his name on the ballot and he got in. He retired about 7 years ago when he hit 70, but he's still very active. Very interesting man. I see his daughter here a lot. She's a school teacher in these school groups here. Now, a little bit about the justices here and the process. In the court system, there are three levels, typically. You've got their local district court, so I think there are 12 in Minnesota, and then you have your Court of Appeals, which is across the street, and then you have the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, they don't do juries. I didn't know that till I came here as an interpreter. They're really an appeals court. And so the way the process would work, I'll actually use a real-world example. It's a little dark, but it's part of Minnesota history, and it's an interesting case. How many people are familiar with the Elizabeth Congdon murder? Yeah, it's a tragic event. It's probably one of our most famous mysteries or crime mysteries. But if you're not familiar with the story, she was her and her nurse, Velma Patillo, I think her name was, were killed up in Duluth about 40 years ago. And her son-in-law was accused and convicted of the crime. And he appealed his conviction. He was convicted in the court of Duluth. I think that was the 6th District Court. So he appealed. He has the right. So he appealed to the Court of Appeals across the street, and they upheld that conviction. And he said there were issues. His attorney said there were issues with the chain of command of or the chain of evidence. There were some real legitimate issues, but they upheld that decision. So he had one last chance to appeal. He appealed here. So when the process was, his attorney was over there. His attorney came over, gets a 5-minute opening statement, and then makes the case why his client was wrongfully convicted. And it's mostly question and answer from the jurors. It's interesting to watch. Then his attorney sat down, then someone from the prosecution's office comes over, they get a 5-minute opening statement, and then they explain, or do question and answer about why Roger Caldwell was guilty and he should stay in prison. And that's it. The process lasts 1 hour, and unless you can show it relates to the U.S. Supreme Court or the U.S. Constitution in some way, then it can go to the Supreme Court. That's rare. Usually it's a freedom of speech or freedom of the press issue. but it's very rare. Usually that's the end of it. If it's a criminal case or a lawsuit, that's usually the end of the story. There actually were 3 different cases related to the Condon murder that came to this court. But the most famous was Roger Caldwell, the person who was accused of murdering these 2 women. So that's the basic process. Believe it or not, they upheld they overturned the district court's decision. In a case like that, it doesn't mean you go free or you've been absolved. It means they have to retry you. And basically, he pled out to second-degree murder. So he served 5 years.
He only served 5 years?
Yeah, 5 years. Yeah, it's an interesting case, very interesting, probably one of our most famous. And once in a while, the History Theater does a play about, which I saw. I've actually seen it twice. It's really pretty interesting about the whole thing. It's a tragedy, but it's still a very, very interesting story. But that's what they do here. Now the art, and this is probably the most expensive art in the Capitol. This was done by a man named John Lafarge. He's most famous for his stained glass work. He did a lot of stained glass work in churches and cathedrals in the East Coast. He did a lot of murals like you see here. His son did a lot of the stained glass in the St. Paul's Cathedral. If you're looking for something to do, a great tour is to do the cathedral. You can do a self-guided tour, or you can do it. I think you have to register, but I think at 1 o'clock on weekdays you can go in and have an interpreter take you through the cathedral. It's a beautiful church. But his son did some of the stained glass work for that. Yeah, these are painted on canvas. There's nothing here that was painted directly onto the walls. You know, some places will do that. Here, the only thing painted on the walls is some of the decorative stuff, the stenciling in the hallways. But the actual paintings were all done on canvas and then shipped out here. These are all done in a studio in New York City where Lafarge lived. And he was kind of a snob. He said, the worst part about these paintings is nobody will ever see them in Minnesota. Yeah, he was kind of a character. But what he was trying to do was he was trying to capture what he thought were the major milestones in the evolution of law. And this is what him and an historian named Henry Adams came up with. The first one is the prophet Moses about to receive the 10 Commandments. And then, so the idea is that our legal codes come from our religious codes. And to my right is the Chinese philosopher Confucius in the blue silk robes, and him and his colleagues are going over scrolls of ancient law decisions, trying to come up with a body of precedents to guide legal decisions. So you're not sort of making it up as you go along. You've got these previous decisions to help you, and that's really what we still do today. You know, it's the idea of precedent. Behind you, and feel free to stand and turn if you'd like. That's the Greek philosopher Socrates. He's the man who's gesturing like this. This is a scene from a book called Plato's Republic, and the book was written 2,500 years ago, but it's still really relevant. And the key issues are what is justice? What is a just society? What's the role of government? What's the role of you as an individual? The key issue, though, is how do you balance your individual rights with the greater needs of society? And they go round and around, and at the end of it, Socrates goes, I don't know the answer to any of these questions. But it's funny, after 2,500 years, you realize this stuff's still relevant. We still struggle with it. And it didn't end well for Socrates. He was executed by the rulers of Athens, so clearly an injustice. And his friends, who we actually know from the book, they were philosophers in the period. They were all exiled by the same rulers. Now the last image, to my left, not a well-known figure. His name is Count Raymond, or Ramon IV. He was a leader of the first Crusades. He died in the Second Crusades. In the time in between, the King of France would often ask him to come and serve as a judge. Now, up until that point in history, the role of the courts were to determine guilt or innocence and determine what kind of punishment made sense. That's not what's going on here. There's some kind of conflict. We don't know exactly what it was, but the men in the red robes are the government officials, the magistrates of the city of Toulouse, and you see the religious leaders on the left-hand side. So there's some conflict between the church and the state. We don't know what it is, but nobody broke any laws. there was no crimes committed, but there's a conflict. Maybe it was over land or revenues or something. But it's the idea that one of the roles of the court is to act as an independent mediator and to kind of resolve those conflicts. So that was kind of a revolutionary thing in the history of law. And speaking of law, you see that lex, L-E-X in the corners? That is Latin for law, Latin, the language of the ancient Romans. And there's a message here. There's lots of messages in this building. Quotes from famous people, a lot of symbolic things. The paintings tell stories. But it's saying we all live under the law. No one is above the law, including the justices themselves. So that's a little bit about what's going on. Any questions so far? I've given a lot of information. Oh yeah, let's back. I kind of jumped the gun a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the building itself and the architect. The architect was born in Ohio, but he grew up here in Minnesota, and he grew up with a couple of other famous architects. Probably the most famous was Clarence Johnston, who built Glensheen. Clarence Johnston built a good part of the University of Minnesota campus, the Northrop Quad. So they were actually good friends. They were partners for a number of years. Both of them built a lot of the mansions along Summit Avenue. But probably Cass Gilbert's most famous works, one was the U.S. Supreme Court building. So when you see that in the news, that's Cass Gilbert. That was his last public building. And he also did the Woolworth skyscraper in New York City. So he had quite a career. Clarence Johnston built a lot more mansions, where Cass Gilbert tended to build public buildings. He built 2 other state capitals. He built one in West Virginia and one in Arkansas, which look kind of similar to this building. Question?
Did he build the James Hill House?
No, that was Peabody and Stearns, I think. That's a beautiful mansion too. If you haven't been to the James J. Hill House, which isn't far from here, that's definitely worth a visit. It's a beautiful mansion. He's an interesting man too. Interesting trivia point, the first building in Minnesota to get electric lighting was the James J. Hill House. Of course, he was the wealthiest man in Minnesota. He could do whatever he wanted. But this was the first public building that got electricity. And Minnesotans are really proud of that in 1905. But this is actually our third building, third capitol. The first one was built in the 1850s when we were still a territory. And that was a nice structure. It's down by the History Theater, Children's Theater down in that area in downtown St. Paul. But when they were restoring it in the 1880s, like what happens a lot of times during restoration, well, the sawdust and solvents and paints had caught on fire and burned down. So they built a brick one in the same area, and that was done by Buffington. Buffington built a lot of the old campus at the University of Minnesota. And that was actually a nice building too, but it was way too small. The state was growing fast. So they started working on this in the 1890s. Yeah, sadly they tore it down. I wish they hadn't. I thought it was a nice looking building. Buffington was a famous architect. Historically, you can see some of his buildings at the University of Minnesota. The Pillsbury building over there is my favorite. That's really a cool building that was done by him. But yeah, they tore it down during the war during World War II for some reason. Yeah, I wish they hadn't. But other questions? Let's go take a look at the house.
You want to look at the house? It's not going to be house, but you're thinking of house.